Hi everyone, my name's Tim. Welcome to my channel. Today I'm going to talk to you about a book that I've just read, which is The Ride of a Lifetime. This is by Robert Iger, more commonly known as Bob Iger, the current CEO of Disney. This was written in 2021, I want to say, just before he retired. And overall, I thought it was really good. So first of all, this was part of my mystery book challenge. My wife's made a little note, so 1 month until Walt Disney World, because we're going next month. So I'm wearing a Team Agrabah t-shirt. I'm here, I've got my Disney book. I also have the Lego model of the multi-plane camera. See that? So I'm in it, you know. So this is the thing. This is what the book looks like. I'm going to take the dust jacket off because I'm not a big fan of dust jackets. Underneath, it's a nice white book with Ride of a Lifetime written like that. So this is split into 2 parts. The first part, what does he call it, is about learning. So it's about his way to getting to Disney and to be CEO. And then the second part is called leading. Yeah, leading. And it's about all of the big deals that he made as CEO. Because as CEO of Disney, he brokered some of the biggest deals in entertainment history. But it wasn't all easy for him. So one thing I quite liked about this is that in the start, it talks about his time in TV. So he started off in ABC in sports, and he was working with this guy who was a bit of a maverick and would do crazy things and would, on the last minute, come in and be like, I want to change this, and get it done. And how Bob didn't really like that. He liked a calmer approach, which you can see actually in his way of being CEO. But one thing he talks about, so he went into sports and they ended up running ABC television, and he talks about the mistakes that he made. So one of them is about Twin Peaks, which was like a cultural phenomenon, and how he messed it up. He convinced David Lynch, the film director, to reveal the killer in the middle of season 2, and it completely tanked the ratings, because the mystery was solved. And then he ended up cancelling it after 2 series, and he was like, "That," he says in here, "that's on me, that's my fault." He also talks about he hired some of the wrong people and he had to fire them, and he talks about firing people and how to do it. So quite a bit of candor. And then it goes to ABC being bought by Disney, and him entering the Disney space, and how with mergers and buyouts, usually the buying company isn't usually buying the property or the IP, they're buying the people, and if they do it wrong, then they destroy the culture of the company that they're buying, which destroys the value of the company that they're buying. So that's something that came out quite a lot. And then it moves into him, doing the big brokers. So as CEO, he bought Pixar in a period when previously the relationship was horrendous. So he had to deal with Steve Jobs. Then he bought Marvel and had to deal with Ike Perlmutter. Then he bought Star Wars, or Lucasfilm, and had to deal with George Lucas. And then he bought 20th Century Fox and dealt with Rupert Murdoch. 4 of the biggest acquisitions in the media space ever. Plus there's a bit about making Disney Plus as well in the second half. The most interesting thing, though, was something that I knew a little bit about because I've watched other Disney documentaries and it's mentioned, but this goes into far more detail on the end of Michael Eisner's reign as CEO and how chaotic it was. And you had Roy E. Disney staging a coup, ultimately, or holding Disney to ransom, saying you need to get rid of Michael Eisner. Again, Bob is quite, he makes his presence known about Roy E. Disney and how he was looking for respect, and he was also an alcoholic and didn't even necessarily get the respect of Walt Disney, and kind of played up that fact in a way. It wasn't in the most glowing light, but it just shows how chaotic Disney was at the time, and after failure after failure. Because that's one thing as well, is that we now think of the Disney Renaissance all the way up till Tarzan, but here they're talking about Hunchback being a flop, not being successful, Hercules being not successful. So it was quite interesting how they view it a bit differently. But yeah, at the end, like, you had the board going, and they kind of took Michael out as president, but they kept him as CEO, so he was a dead man walking, and how Bob had to take over, and the amount of work he had to do to become CEO, because they honestly didn't want another internal Disney person, because Disney had become stagnant and unsuccessful and relying just on theme parks, and that was it. One thing that's, again, you don't see too much into his life, but you do see his relationships a little bit. So he was married and he has 2 daughters, and he talked about how moving from New York to LA, back to New York again, back to LA again, like, ruined his first marriage. And then he remarried a newscaster called Willow something, and again they talked about moving back and forth from New York to LA and how what to do. So that was quite a bit of candor. He talked about how he thought about becoming president, or try to become president. Interesting, because he was like, oh, I would never do it, but really he was doing it, and he was planning on how to do it. But the rest of it, one thing that's, so he becomes CEO, and no one really wants him to be CEO, or a lot of people don't, especially on the board. And then he goes and he has to repair relationships with Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, it's obviously, he has a lot of respect for Steve and for John Lasseter and for Ed Catmull in the Pixar team, because he goes quite a lot into detail about how he brokered that deal, and how 15 minutes before they're going to announce it, Steve Jobs says, let's take a walk. And they go and take a walk, and Steve Jobs tells them that his cancer's come back and that he can back out the deal if he wants. And interesting how it's just, that's a big moment. That's a big moment. And he talks about in here about how he afterwards, he was like, I can't keep this to myself. So he told his wife, and he told like one of his most trusted advisors, and he asked for what he obviously, you only had 15 minutes to make a decision, and he made the decision, but afterwards was checked and was like, what do you think I should have done? Which is quite nice. Yeah, so then he talks about Marvel, and Ike Perlmutter seems to be a bit of a lunatic, which I think is fair to say, and how he kind of brokered that deal, and how he wasn't super into superheroes, and he needed like a little dossier to like keep track of who was who. But he talks about how Kevin Feige just had that magic touch, and he basically chose Kevin Feige over Ike Perlmutter and Avi Arad, like, and had to go to Perlmutter and be like, and Avi Arad, no, you get out of this business, let Kevin do his job. Then Star Wars and Lucasfilm, and one thing that's really interesting that I got from this was that I don't know if George really wanted to sell. He didn't come to Disney saying that he wanted to sell. Bob asked. And then, sorry about that. And then George, there was, my love's allergic to Lucasfilm. George, then they had a lot of negotiation about whether George would still control it, even though it would be owned by Disney, and Bob didn't want that. He wanted to control the thing that he spent a lot of money on. And so in the deal, George was like invited in to be a consultant when Disney invited him, and then he wrote like what the third trilogy would look like, and they didn't use it. So I would love to see what George Lucas's proposal for a third trilogy would be. I would love if that ever came out. And how George then kind of wasn't saying great things in the press about the new films, especially The Force Awakens, because he said it didn't break any boundaries, and every Star Wars film has broken boundaries, both technically as well as story-wise. And you know, Bob talks about how that hurt him emotionally, which I thought was quite interesting. And then the final thing is the 20th Century Fox, and it's clear how more complicated the 20th Century Fox deal was, because the businesses were similar. You had to think about competition law, the global companies, infrastructure, data, Fox News, newspapers. It's beyond just a film studio, and how Rupert Murdoch, how Bob Iger dealt with the family dynamics of the Murdoch family. I've never seen Succession, but it's basically based off the Murdochs, and it's how Rupert Murdoch had sons who would always assume they would inherit it, and his dad was selling it, not to them, and how you manage that. And the thing that came out across all of these big deals is Bob Iger cares a lot about respect. So he obviously wanted to buy all these things, and it was a key strategy for him as CEO. But he never really seemed to push that hard. He would plant ideas and just let them grow and wait for the person like Perlmutter, George Lucas, Steve Jobs, Rupert Murdoch to come back to him. And sometimes it would take weeks, sometimes it would take months. But he would literally just plant the idea and then walk away and give the other person time to react. And then he would never really negotiate. Not a ton. He would say, I'm not going to come in with a very low price to start the negotiation because that's in bad faith. I'm just going to come in at the price that I think I value it at, which is nice to see. And interesting how Comcast were then looking to buy 20th Century Fox, and he came in at he was like, if I beat it by $1 a share, they'll just match it. If I beat it at $2 a share, they'll just match it. So I need to beat it at like $3, $4 a share. I need to kind of blow them out so that it's really clear that I'm not in a race here. I'm just stating the case and making it a clear and obvious decision for 20th Century Fox, and then Comcast pulled out and all that kind of stuff. So really interesting. And then there is, I would say it's mainly memoir, though he does have his lessons at the end, which are just like a list of bullet points, which is a bit strange. It's kind of, there's not like a clear grouping of them. It's literally just I need to make this a business book as well as a memoir, so I'm just going to put in my business tips at the end. One thing that I really liked was the start. The prologue is the most stressful, set in the most stressful week of his life. So he's about to open Shanghai Disney in when was it? When was this week? Let me look it up. 2016, of course. 2016, he's opening Shanghai Disney. He's there in China. He's got a speech that he's practiced in Chinese. Then he gets a phone call that someone has shot up a nightclub in Orlando. And he's figuring out, does he have any staff there? Are there anyone injured? Is there anyone killed? Then they also realise that the shooter was targeting a downtown Disney, before changing his mind and going to a nightclub and shooting it up. So, big thing. And then a little boy got killed by an alligator at the Grand Floridian in the lagoon, which had never happened before, all in the same week. And I remember 2016, I should have remembered, because it was when we got married. So I remember when we were getting ready to go over to Disney World to get married, it was all in the news, especially about the alligator stuff. And we saw the signs, all that had just freshly been painted, But yeah, and he talks about that, and he talks about how he made the decision to talk to the parents of the little boy who died. And it was horrible, but he felt like he had a responsibility to do it. He didn't want to farm it out. So one thing I thought was really interesting reading this now is this was written in 2021 when Bob Iger was known as the best CEO in the world. Like, he had taken a company that was fractious and not very creative in Disney at the time, who were just pumping out flops, and he turned them into a media juggernaut who had the biggest film franchises in the world. He'd bought Marvel, he'd bought Star Wars, he'd bought Pixar, just knocking out the park completely, and was about to retire and head off into the sunset, and handed over to Bob Chapek, who was the head of theme parks at the time. And then in 2022, or, you know, I think, when did this come out? I think it came out in 2021. 2019. So even worse. Yeah, so this came out in 2019, and he was about to retire. And then 2020 happened. So Bob Chapek was CEO for the COVID pandemic, for shutting Disney World. And then in 2019, there were decisions about Disney Plus and pricing strategies. And basically, Bob Chapek wet the bed. Like, he did a really, really bad job of being CEO. And within 2 years, was ousted. And Bob Iger's come back. Like, Bob Iger is now, again, the CEO of Disney, and has dealt with COVID, has dealt with Disney Plus not doing what they wanted it to, has dealt with the writer's strike, the actor's strike. And he didn't want to do any of it. Like, he wanted to retire. And one of the things he talks about is that you can't be in power for too long. Otherwise, you just get sycophants around you, and you try your best to get honest people, but it shapes it. And now he's back as CEO, and he's probably not very happy. So I thought it was quite interesting to see how terrible a job Bob Chapek did, and how they needed to bring Bob Iger back in. But anyway, I gave this 4 stars. I thought it was really interesting. One thing that's, like, Bob Iger is, I think he's just quite a bland person. He's not like, he's not super interesting. It's so, and that comes across here, and that doesn't make it worse to read, but it makes it seem quite realistic. He's not like, oh, I walked in and I saved all the orphans, and, you know, he's not overselling himself. At least one thing he talks about is how respect people and be polite and deal with how you want to be treated, but be honest, and that comes across. That comes across in how he did those deals, and how he's amiable to work with. Yeah, so yeah, 4 stars from me. If you're a big Disney fan, let me know, and please give this video a comment or a like, thumbs up. Give me a subscribe. I'm almost at 100 subscribers, which is very exciting, and I'll see you guys soon. Get out of my house!